One might argue that if the king of Marin had only wanted a beautiful wife, the way every king before him had wanted one, and the way the whole court dearly wished he'd want one now, then Oriane of House Sarn could have lived out her small grey life in her small grey corner, and not a soul would have troubled to look at her twice. But then again, if her aunt had not spent 11 long years painting ruin onto a face that had done nothing to earn it, there would have been nothing for a king to look past in the first place. So really, when the court later set about deciding whose fault the whole scandal had been, and the court of Marin did adore deciding whose fault a thing was, the way other people adored music, the honest answer was that the blame belonged to every powdered, perfumed body in that hall, except the one girl they chose to pin it on. Which was, Oriane would think a great deal later, rather the way of things. But that comes after. On the morning it began, Oriane knew none of it. She knew only that the ash was itching. It always itched worst, on the days it mattered most, as if it could sense an occasion. Her aunt mixed it herself, grey resin and cold hearth ash, and something bitter that stung the eyes, and pressed it into the left side of Oriane's face before dawn, every morning of her remembered life, working it into the skin until the whole cheek looked seamed and melted like a candle left too near a flame. Over that went the veil, grey gauze, doubled, pinned at the temple. For their sake, not yours, Aunt Isora had told her the first time, in the voice one used for a great and tender kindness. Some faces are a burden to look upon, child. The veil is the only gift you have left to give. Oriane had been 9. She had believed her, the way one believes anything, said gently enough and often enough. She believed it still most days, in the marrow, where beliefs go once they've stopped being questions. There had been a fire, once, that much was true. Oriane remembered the heat of it only as a color behind her eyes and a sound she could not name. And afterward the long fever, and afterward the veil, and afterward being told what she now was. House Sarn had been a great house before it, 3 generations of Marin's finest, a name that opened gates. After the fire, the name did less and less, until it opened only the servants' doors of grander houses. And Isara, who had married into Sarn, and outlived everyone worth marrying, held what remained of it in 2 tight fists. There were 3 daughters left to hold. Belise, the eldest, was the sort of beautiful that stopped conversations, gold-haired, warm-mouthed, raised from the cradle for exactly one purpose, which was to be looked at and wanted. Marenka, the youngest, was prettier than she was kind and knew the exact worth of both. And there was Oriane, the middle one, who scrubbed the stone and hauled the water and mended what the other 2 tore, and wore grey, and did not eat at the table, and had learned to move through her own home like whether nobody watched. She was good at it. That was the part no one knew, not her aunt, not her sisters, not the tutors, who taught the pretty girls their letters, where Oriane could overhear from the scullery and steal them for herself. She was good at a great many things. She was never meant to be good at. She could read 3 languages. She could set a broken bird's wing and a broken man's arm. She could loose an arrow into a coin at 40 paces, because the old huntsman had let her, and had died without telling anyone, and she had not stopped. She kept these things the way other girls kept ribbons, privately, and out of the light, because a thing no one knows you have is a thing no one can take. On the morning it began, all 3 daughters were summoned to the great hall of Caden, because the king had come to choose a bride. He came only once in a reign. The Alpha King of the moonward throne, walking the line of every noble daughter of marrying age, while the whole realm held its breath. The old stories said the bond chose for him, that a true king could send his mate across a crowded room, that the moon itself set a mark on the throat of the one meant to wear the crown. The newer, quieter people said the bond was a lovely tale that saved kings the embarrassment of admitting they'd simply picked the richest girl in the room. Either way, houses had risen and drowned on that single morning for 400 years, and Isara had spent every coin and favor she had left, buying Belise a place near the front of the line. Oriane was not in the line. Oriane was brought to carry Belise's train and hold Belise's centoils and vanish the instant she was no longer useful, veiled and grey against the grey stone, a servant who happened to share her mistress's blood. "You will keep the veil down and your eyes on the floor," Isora had said, gripping her chin through the gauze. "You will not shame this house by being seen. Do you understand me, Oriane? Today of all days you are nothing. Be it beautifully." "Yes, Aunt," Oriane had said, because it was easier, and because it was mostly true. So she stood at the back with the other attendants, while the king came through the great doors, and the whole shining line of Marin's daughters drew breath as one he was, younger than she'd pictured, and graver. The songs made the Alpha King a creature of gold and thunder. The man who walked the hall of Kadon that morning was dark-haired and plainly dressed for a king, with a stillness to him that made the perfumed rustle of the court seem suddenly cheap. He moved down the line without hurry. He was courteous to each girl and warm to none. Oriane watched his boots cross the flagstones, eyes on the floor as instructed, and told herself she felt nothing at all about any of it, which was a lie so old and comfortable she no longer noticed telling it. He reached Belise. Oriane heard her sister's practiced little intake of breath, the one they'd rehearsed for a week. She heard the small silence that was meant to be the beginning of the rest of all their lives, and then the boots turned. They did not turn toward Belise. They turned away from her, past the gasp that curdled in her throat, and came unhurried, across the open stone toward the back of the hall, toward the attendants, toward the grey nothing that Oriane had spent her whole life learning to be. They stopped in front of her. The hall had gone so quiet she could hear the torches. She kept her eyes on the floor, on the two dark boots that had no business being there, and her heart slammed once against her ribs, like something trying to get out. "Look at me," the king said. She didn't. She couldn't. Every rule she'd ever been given was screaming at once. "That one," said the king of Marin, to the whole appalled and silent court. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I choose that one." For the length of one held breath, the great hall of Kadon simply refused to believe it. Then it believed it all at once, and the sound it made was not a gasp, but something worse, a low, spreading murmur, the noise a crowd makes when it has been promised beauty and handed a scandal instead. Somewhere near the front, Belise made a sound like a dropped cup. Somewhere behind her, Mareka laughed, once sharp and disbelieving, before someone hushed her. And Aunt Isara Oriane could not see her, but she could feel her, the way one feels a storm 2 rooms away, went absolutely, dangerously still. Oriane's own first thought, absurdly, was that he'd made a mistake. That he meant the girl beside her, the tall one with the good hands, and any moment now a steward would step in and gently correct the error, and she could go back to being furniture. Her second thought was that this was some new and elaborate cruelty, a joke arranged for the court's amusement, and that she should brace for the laughter. Her third thought had no words in it at all. It was only her pulse, and the 2 dark boots, and the impossible fact of being looked at. "Your Majesty." The steward did step forward then, a lean, silver-templed man, she'd later know as Alder, with the tired patience of someone who had spent years catching things his king dropped. He bowed low and spoke low, perhaps a word. "The daughters of the front houses have been presented, and this." "I've seen the daughters of the front houses," said King Corvin. He had not stopped looking at Oriane. She could feel it through the veil like heat off a hearth. Every reign, the same 7 gowns, and the same rehearsed sigh. "I did not ride 3 days to marry a rehearsal." He tilted his head. "What's your name?" The question was for her. The whole court leaned in to hear a servant answer a king. Oriane's mouth had gone to sand. She thought of her aunt's fingers on her chin. "You are nothing. Be it beautifully." And she found, to her own faint astonishment, that some small, hard thing at the bottom of her would not quite do as it was told. "Ariane," she said. "Of House Sarn, your Majesty." "A beat, though I think you the wrong sister." She heard Alder's breath stop. One did not correct the Alpha King. One certainly did not correct him with a dry little edge, from behind a servant's veil, in front of the assembled peerage of Marin. But the king of the moonward throne only smiled, the first true expression she'd seen cross his grave face, quick and surprised, there and gone. "No," he said, "I don't think I have. I'm veiled, sire." It came out steadier than she felt. Say it plainly, she thought, and let him recoil like everyone recoils. And this ends, and I go home to the scullery where I belong. I'm veiled because it spares the court. There was a fire. I'm not. I'm not something a king takes to a throne. Whatever you think you've chosen, it isn't under here. The murmur swelled, delighted and horrified. Isora's stillness had become a thing with weight. And the king did the one thing she had not braced for. He did not recoil. He came half a step closer, close enough that she had to fight not to step back, and when he spoke again it was pitched for her alone, under the noise of the court, so quiet she felt the words more than heard them. "I didn't choose the veil," Corvin said. "I chose what's under it." Oriane's heart stopped, then started again. Wrong. Because there was no way for him to know. No living soul knew what was under the ash and the gauze. Not truly, not since she was 9, and half of them herself included, no longer remembered for certain. He could not have seen. He could not have scented anything through the resin her aunt renewed before dawn each day for exactly this reason, to smother whatever a girl was underneath. And yet he'd said it the way a man says a thing he is simply sure of, the way one names a color. She searched what she could see of his face for the mockery she knew must be there, the twist at the corner of the mouth, the flick of the eyes to a friend that would tell her this was sport. She had spent a lifetime learning to find that look before it landed, the way a struck dog learns the shape of a raised hand. It wasn't there. That was the thing that frightened her. A cruel man, she would have known how to survive. This grave, certain stranger, saying impossible things quietly, and meaning them, she had no defense against at all. "Your Majesty does not understand," she managed. "I understand better than the whole of this room," he said, and stepped back, and let his voice climb again to fill the hall. "The choosing is made. I'll speak with the head of House Sarn." His pale eyes found the storm at the front of the crowd unerringly. "You'll be the aunt. Isora, is it? Walk with me." And that was the end of Oriane's life, as she had known it, decided in the space of 100 heartbeats by a man she had exchanged perhaps 40 words with, while 400 years of custom looked on and could do nothing at all. Because there was no refusing a king, not his choice, not his summons, not his will. A noble daughter of Marin belonged to her house until a king wanted her, and then she belonged to the crown, and the only voice with less say in the matter than Oriane's was the small hard thing at the bottom of her that had spoken up once and would not be so lucky twice. Alder appeared at her elbow, gentle and grave, and murmured that she should come. Behind her she heard Belize begin at last to weep, great gulping sounds, more fury than grief, and heard Isora hush her with a single word, like a blade going home. And as the steward drew her away from the only wretched place she had ever been permitted to belong, Oriane understood 2 things with cold and perfect clarity. The first was that her aunt would never, ever forgive her for being chosen. The second was that somehow impossibly unbearably, the king had known there was something under the veil worth choosing, when Oriane herself had spent 11 years being taught there was nothing under it at all. And she could not decide which of those 2 facts frightened her more. They passed out through the great doors, into the cold bright air of the courtyard, Alder a careful pace behind, and Oriane made herself breathe. Somewhere ahead, the king had already fallen into low conversation with her aunt, and the sight of them together, the man who'd upended her life and the woman who'd built its cage, sat wrong in her chest, in a way she couldn't yet name. She caught only a fragment as she came near, Isora's voice, pitched sweet and reasonable, the voice she used on creditors. A delicate girl, your majesty, and terribly scarred, as I'm sure she's told you. Some kindnesses are better done from a distance. If it would please the crown, I would gladly send her sister Belize in her. It would not, said Corvin without heat, and did not look up. And Isora's mouth closed like a purse. Orion filed that away too, in the quiet, careful place where she kept the things. No one knew she had. Her aunt had just tried to trade her back in the open to a king, and the king had refused before the offer was finished. She only knew that for the length of one sentence, someone with more power than Isora had wanted her more than her aunt wanted her gone, and that had never in the whole grey arithmetic of her life once been true before. They gave her rooms with windows. That was the detail that undid her, in the end, not the silk, not the fire laid and lit by hands that weren't hers, not the astonishing fact of a bed she would sleep in alone and unsummoned. It was the windows. 3 of them, tall as doors, throwing pale morning across a floor she would not have to scrub. In 20 years, Oriane had never once slept in a room with a window she was allowed to look out of, and she stood in the middle of that bright, astonishing space long after Alder had bowed himself out, not touching anything, as if the whole arrangement were a trap that would spring the moment she believed in it. It was a trap, just not the kind she was watching for. The palace of Kayadin, she learned quickly, was not one court but a dozen, each with its own grievances, and every one of them had woken that morning to the same intolerable news. The king had passed over the loveliest daughters of the 7 great houses to raise a veiled servant from a ruined line, and no one knew why. And not knowing why is the one thing a court can never forgive. By midday the whispers had found her through the walls. By evening they had names for her. The Ash Bride, the Grey Mistake, the King's Penance, that one from the pious faction, who'd decided the king must be atoning for some secret sin, to do it so publicly. There were smaller cruelties too, the kind that leave no mark to point at. A lady-in-waiting who curtsied a half-breath too shallow and smiled while she did it. A platter of sweets sent to Oriane's rooms, with the compliments of a house she'd never met. Every one of them turned, faintly, deliberately, to rot. Oriane had been starved of cruelty's louder forms in a house that preferred them. She found she almost preferred the loud kind. At least a slap knew what it was. Ariane heard all of it, because a lifetime of being furniture had taught her to hear everything. She kept the veil down, she kept her eyes low. She moved through the shining halls of her new life, exactly as she'd moved through her old one, quietly, usefully, out of the light, and told herself it was the same skill and would keep her just as safe. It would not. She could feel that much. There is a difference between being unseen, because no one bothers to look, and being unseen, because everyone is looking and waiting for you to slip. The first is a hiding place. The second is a stage with the lamps turned off. And Sidon, for all its windows, was a nest of knives that had simply not yet decided which of them would get to be the one. Her aunt found her on the second day. Izara came as family were permitted to come sweeping into the bright rooms in her best morning gray as though she were the one who'd been wronged, and waited until the servants had withdrawn before she let her face go to its true shape. "Look at you," she said softly, "sitting in silk. Do you imagine it's yours? No, aunt. Good. Because it isn't. None of this is." Izora crossed to her and Orion's whole body braced on instinct, the old animal flinch. But her aunt only reached up, and with the tenderness she saved for her cruelest moments, straightened the veil at Orione's temple. "You will keep this down," she murmured, "every hour, sleeping and waking. You will let no hand near it but mine. I'll come to tend your face myself, as I always have, and you'll send the king's women away when they offer. Do you understand me, child? The moment that court sees what's under there, you are finished, and so is this house. And I promise you, it is this house that will pay first and pay longest." Her fingers tightened, just once, through the gauze. You've done a foolish thing, letting yourself be chosen. Let me undo it, before it ruins us all. Give the king our reason to send you home, and there it was, the shape of the trap under the trap. Oriane had wondered, in the long, bright hours, why her aunt seemed less furious than frightened. Now she heard it plain. Isara did not want her merely returned in disgrace. Isara wanted the veil kept down at any cost, wanted no hand but her own near that face, wanted Orion gone before anyone in Khoidan looked too closely at what 11 years of ash had been smothering. It was not shame in her aunt's voice. It was fear. And fear, in Oriani's experience, was never afraid of nothing. For the first time in her life, standing in a room with windows, Oriane looked at the woman who'd raised her and thought, with a small, cold click, like a key turning, "What are you so frightened I'll find?" She did not say it. She had survived 20 years by not saying things. "Yes, aunt," she said instead, eyes down, and let Isora believe it, and hated how easily the old obedience still came. Isora left satisfied, which was its own kind of answer. That night, Oriane could not sleep. She rose in the dark and went to the tallest of the 3 windows, and stood looking out over the sleeping fortress, at the black gardens and the guttering torches, on the walls and the fat low moon hanging over all of it, and she pressed her fingertips very lightly to the ash on her own cheek, the ruin she had been told to be grateful for. The burden that spared the world her face. And for the first time in 11 years, she let herself wonder if it was real. She thought of the king's certainty, the way he'd said what's under it, as though he'd already seen it and found it worth a crown. She thought of her aunt's fear, so much larger than mere disgrace could explain. She thought of 11 years of gray resin pressed into her skin before she was old enough to ask why, and of the fact that in all those years she had never once been permitted to wash her own face, that Isora had always done it herself, in the dark, with her own 2 hands. A girl who is truly scarred does not need to be watched so closely. You do not stand guard over a ruin. You stand guard over a thing you are afraid will be found beautiful. Ariane pressed harder against the ash, until it flaked, until beneath the grit her fingertips found skin that felt, she could not be sure, she had never been allowed to be sure, smooth, whole, unburned. She was still standing there, one hand to her cheek, and her heart going too fast, when the knock came at her door. It was not a servant's knock, soft and asking. It was not the king's steward or her aunt, returned. It was 3 slow raps, low down on the wood, the way someone knocks when they do not want the guards along the corridor to hear them do it. And when Oriane crossed the cold floor and opened the door a hand's width, there was no one in the corridor at all. There was only a folded square of paper on the threshold, weighted with a single gray stone. She picked it up, she unfolded it by moonlight, 6 words, in a hand she didn't know, pressed hard enough to tear the page, take off the veil. Or, we will, a girl raised gently, would have wept over the note, or run to the guards, or fainted becomingly into someone's arms. Oriane did none of these things, because Oriane had not been raised gently. She read the 6 words twice, committed the hand to memory, hard downstrokes, a left-leaning E, the mark of someone who'd learned letters late and angry, and then she held the paper to her candle and watched it burn to nothing in the washbowl. And she did not sleep, but she did not weep either. A threat, she had learned long ago, is a kind of information. It tells you that you frighten someone. And a person who is frightened of you has, without meaning to, handed you the one thing the powerless are never given, which is a reason to be looked at as dangerous, rather than merely small. Take off the veil, or we will. Someone in Khaden wanted her face shown to the court, publicly, ruinously, on their terms and not hers. Her aunt wanted it kept hidden at any cost. 2 people, Oriane thought, watching the last of the paper curl and blacken, who between them cared a very great deal about a face that was supposed to be worthless. She filed it beside the other things. She was still awake, dry-eyed at the window, when Alder came at mid-morning to say the king requested the pleasure of her company at supper. Requested? Orion repeated. The steward's mouth did something that was almost a smile. His Majesty is careful with the word. He knows the difference between a request and a summons, my lady, even when the rest of the world pretends there isn't one. He paused. It would please him if you came. For what it's worth, and I've served him since he was a boy. I've not often seen it please him to be pleased. Supper was laid in a small stone room off the king's own wing, a fire in the grate and 2 places set, and no servants left standing once. The food was down, which told her something, though she wasn't yet sure what. Corvin rose when she entered. That undid her a little, too. No one had ever risen for her in her life. She sat across from him, with the veil down and her spine straight and her hands folded, and she waited, the way she'd been taught to wait for the game to show its shape. You're wondering why I brought you here, he said. I'm wondering what you want, Your Majesty. It's a different question, is it? In my experience, she let that sit. People who want nothing don't send for you after dark. He laughed. That same surprised, unguarded sound from the hall, as though she kept startling it out of him. Then let me be plain, and you can decide whether to believe me. I want to know you. That's all. I've a whole court that performs for me, 100 faces arranged into whatever they think I'd like to see. I find I've no appetite left for arranged faces. His eyes flicked, once, to the veil, and away. Even the ones I can't see. And the bond, she kept her voice even. The songs say the king's mate is chosen for him, that the moon marks her. That's the story you gave the court, that you simply knew. Is that the truth? Or is it the thing a king says, so he doesn't have to explain himself? Both, Corvin said. It's usually both, with kings. That's a courtier's answer. I'm afraid I'm mostly courtier these days. It's an occupational injury. He turned his cup slowly on the wood. You don't trust me. Good. You'd be a fool to, and you're plainly not a fool. You're the least foolish person to sit at this table in a year. But tell me something, since we're being careful with each other. In the whole of that hall, with the loveliest women in Marin, stood in a row and rehearsed to their teeth, you were the only one who told me to my face that I'd got it wrong. A servant. Veiled, with everything to lose by opening her mouth and nothing at all to gain. He tilted his head. Why did you? Orion considered the fire. Because it was true, she said. And because I thought, if I made the mistake plain enough, you'd send me back before anyone had to know I'd been chosen at all. She heard how bleak it sounded only after it was out. I've found bad news lands softer when you're the one who says it first. Something moved across his face at that. Not pity, she'd have hated pity, but a kind of recognition, quick and quiet, one prisoner nodding to another through the bars. Yes, he said. I know that trick. And for a moment, neither of them said anything, and the fire spoke for both of them, and Orion found the silence with him was not like other silences. It did not ask her to fill it simply let her be in the room. It was a good answer, and that was exactly why she didn't trust it. She had spent a lifetime being managed by people cleverer than they were kind, and she knew the taste of a truth cut to fit. She reached instead for her cup, and that was when she noticed the first thing. He was sitting with his back to the wall, not the fire. He had chosen the chair that put the flames well away from him, and when a log cracked and spat a bright spark toward the hearthstones, his hand tightened on the table's edge, small, fast, mastered in an instant. But she had spent 11 years reading the tightening of hands. The Alpha King of Marin, who was said to fear nothing under the moon, did not like fire. She said nothing. She kept it, and went hunting for the second thing, because there is always a second thing. She found it 3 courses later, when he was easy in talking, when he thought she'd stopped fencing. He said offhand that he'd heard she read Old Vaelish, and that he'd never met a lady of Marin who bothered. Orion went very still behind her veil. I never told you I read Vaelish, she said quietly. I've never told anyone. There's no one in my house who'd have known it to tell. I taught myself from a book I stole out of a locked room, and I have never once said it aloud. to a living soul. She set down her cup. So I'll ask you plainly, and you can decide whether to lie. You didn't choose me across a crowded hall by the grace of the moon, your majesty. You came to that choosing, knowing my name. You knew what I could do before I ever opened my mouth. You came for me. And her heart was going hard, but her voice did not shake. Why? What do you know about me that I don't? The ease went out of him all at once, like a tide pulling back. For a long moment, the king of all Meran simply looked at her across the small bright table, and the charm was gone, and what was left underneath was something careful and old, and she thought, afraid. Ask me an easier question, Corvin said softly, which was of course an answer all its own. He would not give her more that night. He turned the talk gently and firmly aside, walked her back to her rooms himself through the sleeping halls, and left her at her door with a bow and a look she couldn't read, regret in it, and something that was almost apology. Ariane lay awake till dawn, turning his silence over in her hands. Ask me an easier question. He knew her. He had come for her. And whatever the truth was, it was large enough that a king who feared nothing would rather look afraid than speak it. She had 4 days to wonder, because on the 5th, the whole realm came to look at her. It was called the presentation, an old rite, older than the choosing, in which the king's chosen bride was shown to the assembled houses of Meran, so that the realm might, in theory, rejoice. The king's women came at dusk to dress her, and Oriane sent them away at the door and dressed herself, because she could not bear the thought of hands near the veil that weren't her own, and because the note still burned behind her eyes. Take off the veil, or we will. She had said nothing of it to anyone. There was no one in Kaidane she trusted enough to tell, and telling a secret she'd learned was only ever handing someone a new place to press. So she went alone into the lion's mouth in silver gray, and she was ready for hatred, and she was ready for scorn, and she was not ready, because how could she be? For how beautiful they made the killing look. She was walked the length of the great hall on Corvin's arm, past 1,000 candles and 10,000 eyes, and the houses she had shamed by existing rose as she came, and bowed and made their faces due rejoicing, and every bow was a blade turned flat so the edge wouldn't show. She could feel the hatred under it, like a draught under a door. It came off the 7 great houses in waves, the ones who'd spent fortunes on a morning a servant had stolen from them with her silence. Corvin felt it too. She could tell by the set of his jaw, by the way his hand stayed warm and steady over hers, as if to say, let them look. But a king's steady hand cannot stop a room from deciding it has been robbed. It can only walk you through the middle of the decision and hope you both come out the far side. Her aunt was there, near the front, in grey pelisse beside her, lovely and cold. And beside them, a woman Oriane had not met, tall, jeweled, with a smile like a drawn wire, whom she would learn too late to name as Lady Varin, whose house had expected the crown and had not got it, and who had spent 4 days deciding that if she could not have a queen from her own blood, she would at least have the satisfaction of a public ruin. Their eyes met across the bright hall, Oriane's and the jeweled woman's, and Lady Varin's wire smile widened by a fraction, the way a smile does when its owner knows a thing you don't and is about to enjoy your learning it. Some animal part of Oriane, the part the old huntsman had trained, went cold and still and said, low and certain, there, that one. That's where it comes from. She had half a heartbeat to understand it. That was all the warning she got. It happened between one step and the next, a press of bodies, as the houses crowded near, to bow, a jostle, too neat to be chance. And then a hand, not Lady Varin's own. She was far too clever for that. It was some paid, forgettable hand from the crush, closed in the silver gauze at Oriane's temple, and tore. The veil came away. For one endless, roaring instant, the left side of Oriane's face was bare to the whole court of Meran. She heard the gasp go up, a great indrawn breath from 1,000 throats at once, and she froze, waiting for the recoil, for the laughter, for the ruin she had been promised her whole life. Her hand flew up too late, and in flying up, it dragged across her own cheek, across gray ash gone loose, with the sweat of the hot bright hall, and the ash smeared. And under it, where 11 years had promised her only melted ruin, there was a thin bright line of silver. She saw it herself. That was the thing that stopped her heart, not the court, but the great burnished shield hung on the wall beside her, and her own smeared reflection in it. The ash come away in a streak, and beneath the streak, running from cheekbone to jaw, a line of pale radiance like moonlight caught under skin. Like something written on her in a language she'd been forbidden to read. Not a scar, never a scar, a mark. For one impossible instant she did not recognize her own face. She had not seen it clean since she was 9 years old. Isora had forbidden mirrors, forbidden still water, forbidden even the backs of polished spoons, and the girl in the burnished shield was a stranger, wide-eyed and streaked and shining, with a jaw that had never known a flame and a silver line burning quietly beneath the grit, as though it had been waiting under there all along for someone to wipe the lie away. Something in her chest gave a great slow lurch, like a foot finding a stair that wasn't there. 11 years, said the small cold voice at the bottom of her. 11 years, and this is what they buried. It was gone in an instant. She got her hand up, she covered it. The whole exposure could not have lasted the length of a breath. But some things do not need longer than a breath. A struck bell does not need you to keep hitting it to go on ringing. The hall did not know what it was seeing. The hall saw only that the ruined bride was not ruined, that under the gray there was something strange, and shining where there should have been melted ruin. And it did the thing crowds do when the story they were promised turns inside out in front of them. It went utterly, ringingly silent. 1,000 people who had come to watch a plain girl be plain stood with the rejoicing frozen half-made on their faces, and did not know whether they had just seen a wound or a wonder. But Oriane wasn't watching the hall. She was watching her aunt, because everyone else in that vast bright room wore shock or hunger or the wide blank stare of people witnessing a thing too large to hold. Everyone except Isara, who alone in all of Marin. Isara's face, across the sea of astonished faces, held one single, naked, unmistakable thing. It was terror. The pure white terror of a woman watching, at last, the one thing she had spent 11 years and every cruelty she owned to keep from ever being seen. Corvin moved before anyone else in the hall had finished drawing breath. He was between Oriane and the court in a single stride, his own dark cloak sweeping up and around her, and then he was walking her, fast, sure, one arm iron across her shoulders out through a side door she hadn't known was there, into a cold stone passage where the roar of the hall fell away behind them like a closing wave. He did not stop until they were 3 turns deep and alone. Then he let go of her and stepped back, and gave her the thing she needed most, which was room. Oriane stood with her back to the cold wall, and her hand pressed over the bare, silver-streaked side of her face and shook, not with fear, with the sheer seismic wrongness of it. 11 years, and it was a lie. All of it, the ash and the veil and every gentle voice that had told her she was a burden to look upon. Some kindnesses are better done from a distance. The veil is the only gift you have left to give. She heard her aunt's voice saying it, the tender voice, the one saved for the cruelest hours. And she understood at last that every soft word had been a lock, and she had thanked the woman for turning the key. Her legs would not quite hold her. She slid down the wall and sat on the freezing stone in her ruined silver gown, and the king of all the land crouched down across from her and waited, saying nothing, while she came apart quietly and put herself back together. He did not touch her. He did not fill the silence with comfort she couldn't yet hear. He only stayed, close and unhurried, the way you stay with a frightened animal until it remembers you're not the thing hunting it. And Oriane, who had never in her life had anyone simply stay, felt that plain, unglamorous patience reach some deep locked room in her that 100 pretty words could never have found. "It's not a scar," she said at last. Her voice came out wrecked. "There was never any scar. She painted it on me. Every morning since I was 9. She told me I was hideous, and she painted a lie on my face, and She stopped. I believed her. I let her. For 11 years. "You were a child," Corvin said. "Children believe the people who feed them. That isn't weakness. It's how we're built." He was quiet a moment. Then, carefully, as though setting down something that might break, "May I tell you the thing you asked me for? The easier question I wouldn't answer." She looked at him. She nodded. 11 years ago," he said, "there was a fire in the east wing of House Sarn. You know this part. You were 9. What you don't know is that the fire wasn't an accident, and it wasn't meant for your house. I was there. I was a boy of 14, a guest. The heir to a throne. My father had made a great many enemies to hold, and someone had decided the cleanest way to end the moonward line was to end me somewhere. It could be blamed on a candle." He drew a slow breath. "I was trapped. The smoke had me. I'd stopped being able to tell the floor from the ceiling. And then a girl came through the fire. A girl no one had sent. No one I could see clearly. Small and coughing. And absolutely certain. And she got her hands in my collar and she dragged me out. And somewhere in the dark and the heat, when she pulled me free, something passed between us. I felt it. I felt it every day of my life since." His voice had gone rough. "And then the roof came down between us. And when I could see again, she was gone. And I never learned her face or her name. Only that the bond had found her in the worst night of my life, and then taken her away again, before I could even thank her." He reached up slowly and pulled loose the collar of his own shirt and turned so the firelight from a far sconce caught his shoulder. There, across the skin, ran an old burn, long-healed, silvered at the edges, the unmistakable ridge of a wound taken from flame. "You gave me this," Corvin said quietly, pulling me out. "I've carried it 11 years, along with the question." And then, not a fortnight ago, I stood in a hall full of Marin's daughters, and across a crowded room, through 11 years and a lifetime of ash, I caught a scent I'd have known in my grave. His eyes found hers, steady and undefended, the mask gone entirely now. "I didn't choose the veil, Orion. I told you that. The fire didn't take your face. It gave you the mark. And someone has spent 11 years making very, very sure you'd die not knowing it was there." Oriane sat with the truth of her whole life turning over inside her. And under it, beneath the shock, beneath the grief, for 11 stolen years, something else had woken. She had felt it stir the moment he pulled his collar loose, and it had grown with every word, and now it filled her chest like a tide coming into a room. A second pulse that was not her own, warm and steady and unmistakably his, threaded straight through the place beneath her ribs where she had always been most alone. She could feel him, his fear that she wouldn't believe him, his grief, old and worn smooth. And beneath it all, a tenderness so vast and so undefended that it terrified her because it was aimed at her, and she had never once in her life been the thing that anyone looked at like that. It would have been so easy to fall into it. That was the danger. Wanting to believe a beautiful thing was exactly how a clever girl got made a fool. She had watched it happen to others, had built her whole survival on never once being the one who reached for the shining thing and got her hand caught. A man like this, with a face like that and a voice gone soft, and a story that made her the secret heroine of her own stolen life. Of course, she wanted it to be true. That was what should have frightened her about it. That was the trap she knew how to name. So she did the things she had always done when something was too large and too good to be safely believed. She got to her feet, unsteady, and she stepped back out of his reach, and she pressed the truth of him down under her ribs, where she wouldn't have to feel it, and she said, "No." He blinked. "Oriana?" "No," she said again, steadier for the second one. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to be the only kind thing in 11 years, and expect me to simply— Her voice cracked and she hated it. I don't know you. I know a supper or two, and a fire I don't remember, and a mark I've never seen with my own two eyes. That's not a bond. That's a story. And I have had my whole entire life built out of somebody else's story, Your Majesty, and I am done living inside one. She was at the mouth of the passage now, the roar of the distant hall rising to meet her. Whatever this is, I can't. I won't. And she turned. And she left the King of Marin crouched alone on the cold stone, with his collar open and his oldest wound bare, and the bond ringing between them like a bell nobody had answered. There is a particular loneliness to being right. For 3 days Oriane practiced it. She kept to her rooms with the windows she no longer looked out of. She replaced the ash on her own cheek each morning with her own hands, the smell of it turning her stomach now that she knew it for a lie. But she smeared it on anyway, because a lie, you understand, is a kind of armor, and she was not ready to walk out from behind it. She was cold to the servants and colder to herself, and when the king sent, and he did send, every day, though never a summons, always a request, she was free to refuse. She refused. A book of Valish verse left at her door with no note. A branch of winter cherry in a plain cup. Once, only, a single line in his own hand. I am not going anywhere. Take the time you need. She read it 4 times, and then put it face down in a drawer, because the trouble with the King of Marin was that he kept declining to behave like a trap, and a trap that will not spring is very hard to keep on watching for. The bond made it worse. She could feel him now, always, a low, warm presence at the bottom of her ribs, and she hated that it was steady. She could tell he was not sulking. She could tell he was simply waiting, patient as weather, giving her the one thing no one had ever given her, which was the room to say no and mean it. It would have been so much easier if he had pushed. He came to her only once in those 3 days, and he did not push then either. It was late, and she was on the north wall where the sentries didn't walk because she had discovered she could breathe there. He came along the parapet with his hands open and visible, and stopped a careful distance off. I won't stay, he said. I saw you from the yard. I only wanted to make sure you weren't out here freezing on my account. A pause. The high walls are where I come to breathe too, when the palace gets too loud, so I thought I'd look in. I only came up for the air, Your Majesty. So did I, he agreed. The quiet up here is the one honest thing in this whole fortress. It's one of the things I like best about you. That you go looking for it too. And he almost smiled, and she almost did, and for a moment, they stood in the cold, with the whole sleeping realm below them, and the bond humming quietly between. Why do you keep doing that? She said at last. It came out before she decided to say it. Leaving me be, sending things I can send back. Any other man in your place would have simply taken. It's within your right. The whole realm would call it your right. She made herself look at him. You could make me want you, I think. That's the part I can't forgive. You could reach into this bond and pull, and I'd feel it, and half of me would call it my own heart, and you don't. Why? Corvin was quiet a while. The torches guttered along the wall. Because it was done to me, he said finally. Not the bond, the other thing. Being decided. He looked out over the dark. I know exactly what it costs to be reached into. I'd sooner lose you, honestly, than keep you that way. That's all. It's not nobility, Oriane. It's the one thing I've got that nobody arranged. And for a moment, they stood in the cold, and the bond went thin and warm and treacherous under her feet. He did not close the distance. He let her keep it. And somehow, his not reaching reached her more than any hand could have. And she had to look hard at the dark gardens to keep her face from giving her away. When he left first, which no one who wanted something from her had ever done. She might have thawed the whole way. In time, she never got the time. Because on the 4th morning, her aunt came to tend her face, as she always came, and Oriane, playing the dull, obedient thing she had played her whole life, Because some skills never leave you, let herself be handled and watched. And when Izora set down her little pot of resin to answer a knock at the outer door, Orion saw, for 1/2 second, the corner of a folded paper protruding from the woman's sleeve, sealed in gray wax. She didn't know. She had it out and back before her aunt turned round. She had been stealing unnoticed since before she could read. That night alone, she broke the seal. The letter was in Old Valish. Of course it was. It was the one tongue no lady of Marin troubled to learn, the dead scholar's language, locked in the room she'd stolen it from as a child, safe, private, unreadable to anyone who mattered. Which was exactly why the person who wrote it had never once imagined the veiled servant girl, bent over it by candlelight, could read every word. She sat with it a long time before she understood what she was holding. Her hands, she noticed distantly, had begun to shake. Not the reader's hands, but the child's, the 9-year-old's, some part of her that had waited 11 years in the dark to be told she hadn't imagined the fire and hadn't imagined the fever and hadn't, whatever they'd said after, imagined that she'd once been someone worth pulling out of a burning room. She read it 3 times, and with each reading, the floor of her life dropped further away. It was not a love letter, and it was not a lie. It was an account. It spoke of an arrangement, 11 years old, of a debt kept, and a silence bought. It spoke of the girl, the asset. It called her never a name, and of how the asset had been kept marked, but hidden, veiled and worthless, and out of the wolf's reach, so that the wolf would go to his grave unbonded and therefore, it said, killable. It spoke of a first attempt that had failed by fire long ago, and of patience, and of a second and final one, near now, at hand. And in the last line, in a hard left-leaning hand, Ariane had seen once before pressed into 6 words, on a scrap of paper, it named the hour. The king of Marin would not live to see his own wedding feast burn down around him. Ariane sat very still with the proof of everything in her 2 hands, the fire, the mark, the 11 stolen years, the whole shape of the cage, and the names of the ones who'd built it, and understood, with a lurch of pure cold horror, that the feast was tomorrow night, and that she had spent 3 days pushing away the one man in the world she now had to save. She rose to run to him. Isora was standing in the doorway. "You've read it," her aunt said. She did not sound afraid. That was the thing Oriane would remember. Isora looked at the broken seal, and the open letter, and her niece's bare shock, and what crossed her face was not terror, but a kind of weary irritation, the look of a woman who has dropped a stitch after a long and tedious piece of work. "You always were too clever for the use we had of you," she said. "I told them, keep her stupid," I said, "or keep her gone. They would insist on keeping her only hidden," she sighed. "Give me the letter, Orion." Orion's voice came from very far away. "The mark, all of it. You knew what I was, and you painted ash on it every morning in my life, and you told me I was hideous. You told me to be grateful." "I told you what kept you alive," Isora said, and for one moment, there was almost something human in it. "A marked mate the king never finds is a servant girl who grows old in a scullery. A marked mate the king finds is a war. I chose the scullery for you. You might, one day, have thanked me." She held out her hand, the letter. "There are men in the corridor, child. There have always been men in the corridor. Did you think you were guarded for your safety?" And Oriane, who had spent 20 years doing as she was told, looked at the outstretched hand of the woman who had built her whole small cage, and did the second, brave thing of her life. She went out the window. It was 3 floors up, and she had spent a childhood climbing where she wasn't allowed. And the ivy on the east face of Caden was old and thick, and Isara had never once thought to wonder whether the veiled drudge could climb, because you do not imagine your furniture has been practicing. Oriane went down it in the dark, with the letter in her teeth and her heart in her throat, and dropped the last span into the frozen kitchen garden, and ran. She could smell the smoke before she reached the hall. That was the thing the conspirators had not accounted for. In all their patience, that the girl they'd kept veiled and worthless had a wolf's own nose and a huntsman's own training, and that Oriani caught the first gray thread of it on the wind 2 courtyards off and knew, with a lurching certainty, that they had not waited for the wedding feast at all. They had moved the hour. The revel was tonight. The eve, the lesser feast. The king relaxed among friends and half his guard stood down, and someone had already put the torch to the great hall's understores. She hit the doors as the first screams went up, for half a heartbeat on the threshold. She was 9 years old again. The same heat, the same roar, with no shape to it, the same smell of a great house learning to burn. Her body wanted to lock. She had always assumed the fire she couldn't remember had left her afraid somewhere, too deep to reach. Standing in the doorway of the burning hall, she found out the truth of it. She was not afraid. Whatever the fire had done to her at 9, it had not made her flinch from flame. It had made her the one person in Caden who could walk into it. She had simply been told, like everything else, to believe the opposite. The hall was chaos and smoke, 100 nobles surging for exits that someone had thought to bar, and at the high end, cut off by a wall of climbing flame, stood Corvin. He was not running. He was getting others out, hauling a fallen woman up, shoving a boy toward a window. But she saw his face in the firelight, and she knew that look, because she had worn its cousin, the fixed sick dread of a man alone with the one thing that had nearly killed him as a child. He had frozen once, in a fire, at 14. She could see him fighting not to freeze now, and in the smoke behind him, unhurried, a shape moved with a bow. Oriane did not think. Thinking was for people with time. She tore a bow from the hand of a panicking guard who'd forgotten he held it and a single arrow with it, and she went still in the center of the burning hall, the way the old huntsman had taught her a lifetime ago. Breathe out and loose on the empty lung. And she put the arrow through the assassin's shoulder as his own string reached his cheek. He went down, his shot went wide into the rafters, and Corvin, at the sound, turned and saw her across the fire. "The East Arch," she shouted. "It's not caught yet, Corvin. Move the arch." And when he did not move, when the fire held him where he stood, she did the only thing left. She went into it. Through the flame, the way a girl of 9 had once gone through it for a boy she couldn't see, and she got her hands into his collar, exactly as she had 11 years before, and she pulled. He came. Of course he came. His hand closed over her wrist and gripped, and the freeze broke, and he moved, and she felt it go through the bond the instant it happened. The terror loosening its hold on him, replaced by something steadier that had her scent in it. They went out through the East Arch together into the cold, clean night and fell coughing onto the frost, alive, both of them. Her hands still fisted in his ruined collar and his heart slamming under her knuckles. "Twice," he rasped when he could speak, his eyes streaming from the smoke and something else besides. "You've done it twice now, and I never even got to." "Later," she said. "We're not out of it." And she was right. They weren't. But for one shining instant, the whole terrible thing was simply that she had saved him twice now, and he was looking at her as though the sun had come up in the middle of the night. Then, the yard filled with people, and the instant ended, and Lady Varen began to scream. There, she was pointing jeweled and immaculate and untouched by any smoke. Her face, a mask of horror pitched for the gathering crowd. The veiled one, she knew. She had a bow before the fire was seen. She came armed to a revel. Ask her how she knew. Ask her what she is. That is no bride, that is their creature. That is the witch they marked and sent among us. And the terrified court, coughing and bleeding and desperate for the fire to have a face, turned as one toward the girl in the smeared veil kneeling over their king with a bow at her side, and Oriani saw the story turn inside out around her, saw the rescue become the crime in the space of a breath, and saw the guards start toward her, while Corvin was still on his knees, fighting for the air to speak. They gave her a cold room with a barred door and called it a courtesy, on account of her being for one more day the king's chosen. Oriane sat in it through the dark hours, with the smell of smoke still in her hair, and understood that Varen had done something almost elegant. She had not needed the lie to be believed. She had only needed it to be sayable, to hang in the air of a frightened court long enough that freeing the veiled witch became a thing the king could not simply do without seeming ruled by her. In one stroke she had turned Oriane's bravest act into the proof against her, and left Corvin a choice between his crown and his mate, with the whole realm watching which he'd pick. Isora came at the turn of the night, because of course she did. Some people cannot resist collecting a thing they've won. You should have given me the letter, her aunt said through the bars. You should have let me burn at 9, Oriana answered, and saved yourself the trouble. She did not rise. She had done all her rising for one lifetime out a third-floor window. Tell me one thing, and I'll stop asking the rest. Did you ever, once, in 11 years, did any part of you look at me and feel anything at all? For a moment, she thought her aunt wouldn't answer. Then Isora said, quite simply, no, not cruel, worse than cruel. Hating you would have been a feeling, child, and feelings are expensive. You were an asset. I kept you in good repair, and I spent you where you'd fetch the most, which is more than most girls of a ruined house can hope for. Your sister will have Varen's son, and a seat at a table that matters. You bought that. Be proud of it, if you must be anything. She drew her gray shawl close. The bond was always going to be your death. I only decided when. I'd have thought of the two of us. You'd understand, choosing the scullery over the war. Belize, Oriane said, before she could go. Does she know what you did to me, what you're selling her into? Does she know any of it? Isora paused at the bars. Belize knows how to smile at a man she's afraid of, she said. I saw to that too. You were not the only daughter I made useful, child. You were only the one who cost the least to break. I gave you the safest life House Sarn had to give. That it was a small one is the world's fault, not mine. Remember that. When they put the crown on you and you feel like hating me, somebody had to keep you alive long enough to be hated. And she left, and Oriane sat alone, with the truth she had spent a whole life being protected from, and waited for it to break her. It didn't. That was the thing none of them had ever understood, not Isora, not Varen, not the whole shining court that had decided what she was. They had built her a cage out of a single lie, that she was nothing, worthless, a burden the world was spared from looking at. And now the lie was simply gone, wiped away like ash under a wet thumb, and what was left standing in the cold cell was not a broken girl at all. It was a woman who could read 3 languages and set a bone and put an arrow through a shoulder in a burning room, who had gone through fire twice and come out both times, who had been so thoroughly taught she was nothing that no one had ever thought to guard against what she actually was. The cage had no floor anymore. She had been standing on solid ground the whole time, and calling it a pit because that was what she'd been told to call it. She had spent 11 years hoarding small secret skills, the languages, the arrows, the setting of bones, telling herself it was only defiance, the one thing of her own that no one had given her. She understood. Now she had been arming herself the whole time, without once admitting she meant to fight. Well, she admitted it now. She was still sitting there, dry-eyed and terribly calm, when the bar on the door slid back, and Corvin came in. He looked as though he hadn't slept. There was soot still at his jaw, and a burn dressed on one hand, and he stopped just inside the door and did not come closer, giving her the room the way he always did. I know you didn't do it, he said. I knew before you pulled me out of the fire. I've known since a supper where you told me I'd got the wrong sister. His voice was low and rough. I could tear that door off. I could have Varen in irons by morning, and never mind the court. Say the word and I will. And prove her right, Oriane said. That the king does whatever his witch tells him, that the bond's a leash. She shook her head slowly. No, if you free me, I'm a thing you couldn't rule without. I don't want to be freed, Corvin. I want to be believed. There's a difference, and I've spent my whole life on the wrong side of it. There it is again, he said softly. You keep choosing the harder door. The scullery over the war, your aunt would say. Except you never once actually chose the scullery, did you? She chose it for you, and called it yours. This is the first time I've watched you pick the harder thing with your own hand, and you've picked it 3 nights running. Something moved in his face, rough and unguarded. I spent 11 years looking for the girl who walked into a fire for a stranger and asked nothing back. I keep forgetting she never left. She was just told to stand very still and answer to a different name. Don't, Oriane said. Don't make me brave. I'm frightened enough as it is. You can be both, he said. I've it on good authority. You told me so on a wall. He was quiet a moment. Then, tell me what you need. An open court, all of them. Varen, my aunt. The 7 houses. Every face that decided what I was, without once looking. She rose, then, and crossed to him, and she was not afraid, which astonished her more than anything else in that whole astonishing month. I have the letter, in a hand the court can't read, and I can. That alone unmakes half her plot. But a letter can be called a forgery. She lifted her chin. So I'll give them the one thing that can't be forged. Tomorrow, in front of all of them, I'm going to take it off myself. Her hand rose to the smeared gray veil. The ash, the 11 years of it, the thing I've been most afraid of my whole life. I'm going to choose it. And I'm going to let the whole court see exactly what my aunt spent everything she had to keep them from ever seeing. Corvin looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he saw made his throat work. You know what it will show them, he said quietly. You've never even seen it whole yourself. No, Oriane agreed. So we'll find out together, won't we? You and the entire kingdom of Marin, and she almost smiled. Ask me tomorrow, your majesty, whether I'm still afraid. They convened in the great throne hall of Caden, at noon, because Varen had asked for daylight. She wanted the veiled witch shown plainly, wanted no shadow for a bride to hide in, and it was the last mistake she would make in Marin. The hall was full, the 7 houses in their ranks, the pious faction and the ambitious one. Belize, pale beside their aunt, Marenka wide-eyed, Alder grave at the king's shoulder. Corvin sat the moonward throne and did not look like a man who would save her. They had agreed on that. If he seemed to shield her, the shield became the story. So he sat cold and still, and let her walk out alone into the center of the hall in her smeared gray veil, accused, unfree, with nothing at all in her hands but a folded scrap of paper, and let the court believe it was about to watch a reckoning it would enjoy. Varen laid it out beautifully. The armed stranger, the fire she'd known of, the witch mark glimpsed at the presentation, proof of unnatural craft, the ruined house that had schemed its creature onto the throne. She walked the length of the hall as she spoke, gathering the room the way a good speaker does, turning frightened faces toward the outcome she wanted, and she was persuasive and jeweled and sure. It was, Oriane thought, watching her own execution built sentence by careful sentence, genuinely well made. They had wanted the Ash Bride to be something wrong from the very first day. Varen was merely handing them permission. Oriane let her finish every word, because a thing is heaviest just before it's turned over, and because she had spent 20 years learning the exact patience of the powerless, and today for the first time it was a weapon instead of a wound. Are you finished, my lady? Oriane asked, when she was. Her voice carried further than she'd expected. Then it's my turn to speak, and I'll be brief, because I've only 2 things to show you, and the first is this. She lifted the letter. An account, 11 years long. The arrangement that hid a marked girl from her own king, so that he'd die unbonded and easy to kill. The first attempt, by fire, when I was 9. The second, 2 nights ago, in your understores. It names the hour, it names the debt, and it is written, she turned it to the hall, in Old Vialish, which the writer chose, because no one in Marin troubles to learn a dead tongue. No one, that is but a servant girl, locked out of every room but the one where the book was kept, and she read it aloud. All of it. In a clear, steady voice, in the dead scholar's language, and then in plain marish for the room, while Lady Varen's beautiful certainty curdled slowly to something the color of the ash on Oriane's cheek, and Isora went the shade of a woman hearing her own handwriting recited back to her by the asset she'd sworn couldn't read. "That is a forgery," Varen said, but her voice had lost its floor. "It might be," Oriane agreed. "You'd be right to wonder. A letter can be forged. A hand can be copied." She let the paper fall to the marble. "So here is the second thing. And this one, my lady, no one alive can forge." And Oriane of House Sarn reached up, in the noon light of the great hall of Caden, in front of the 7 houses and the throne, and the woman who had raised her to believe she was nothing. Her fingers found the pin at her temple. And for one heartbeat, she would admit this to Corvin later, in the dark, when there was no one left to perform courage for one single heartbeat, the old terror rose up whole. 11 years of it, every gentle warning her aunt had ever pressed into her. Some faces are a burden to look upon. The moment that court sees what's under there, you are finished. Her hand nearly stopped. The child in her who had believed all of it begged her to stop. She thought of Corvin on the wall, saying, "You can be both." She thought of a girl walking into a fire because no one had told her yet that she couldn't, and she took the child by the hand, gently the way someone should have 11 years ago, and she said, "Not this time." And she took off her veil. She let it fall. It drifted to the marble, gray and weightless, a thing that had ruled her whole life and weighed nothing at all. And then, slowly, with the flat of her hand, she wiped away the ash. 11 years of it. The gray resin came away in long streaks, and fell in flakes to the bright floor, and beneath it, rising into the daylight for the first time since she was a child, was her face, unburned, unscarred, whole, and across it, blooming from cheekbone to jaw and down the line of her throat, the mark. Not a thin silver line now, not a glimpsed streak, but the whole of it, unhidden and complete. A spill of pale radiance in the shape the old stories drew. Moonlight caught living under skin, the mate mark of the moonward throne. The thing 400 years of Marin had sung about, and not one soul in that hall had ever actually seen. The court of Marin made no sound at all. It was not the silence of shock this time. It was the silence of 1,000 people, looking at the one thing their whole faith was built on, and finding it real, the bond made flesh, the moon's own mark, plain as morning on the face of the girl they'd called the Ash Bride, the gray mistake, the king's penance. An old lord of the pious faction went down slowly onto one knee, and then another beside him, and then it moved through the hall, like wind through standing grain, not because anyone commanded it, but because there are things a person kneels to without being told. Belize's hand had risen to her own mouth, and Isara, who had spent 11 years and every cruelty she owned making certain this exact moment never came, stood alone and unbowed in the sea of bending backs, and watched her life's work end in the light she'd spent everything to keep out. And into that ringing silence, Corvin rose from the throne, and crossed the hall, and stopped before her, and pulled loose the collar of his own shirt to bare his shoulder, and the old burn there had changed. Where the fire scar had been, silver had risen to answer hers, the same living light, the bond written on them both at once, blazing brighter the nearer he came, so that no one in that hall could any longer pretend it was craft, or paint, or lie. "Ask me now," Oriane said to him, very quietly, so only he could hear, "whether I'm still afraid. Are you?" "No." And it was true. And the truth of it went straight through the bond, so he'd know she wasn't being brave. Not of them. Not of this. Not anymore. It ended quickly. After that, the way these things do once the floor drops out of them. Varen tried once to speak, to call it glamour, sorcery, a wolf's trick, but the words had nowhere to land now, because every soul in the hall had felt the thing the 2 marks did when Corvin crossed the floor, that soundless brightening in the air like the moment before lightning, and you cannot argue a room out of what its own skin has felt. Her own allies stepped back from her as from something catching, and the houses that had smiled at her found urgent reasons to be looking elsewhere. Isora did not run. She had never in her life done anything so undignified as run. She only stood with her accounts undone around her while the guards came, and looked at Orion with an expression that was at the very last almost like respect, which was the only inheritance she had ever meant to leave, and the only one Orion would ever refuse. "You'd have made a magnificent asset," her aunt said as they took her arm. It was, Orion understood, the nearest thing to love the woman had. She let it fall to the marble beside the veil, and did not pick it up. They took them both. The foreign hand behind the coin would be a longer hunt, and there would be hard months in it, and letters in a dead language to trace to their end. But the plot died in that hall at noon, in the silence, after a veil hit the floor and everyone present knew it. And when it was done, when the hall had emptied of everything but smoke and aftermath, Corvin turned to her, not as a king to his vindicated bride, with the whole matter settled, and the wedding back on, and the bond proved before the realm. He turned to her instead, as though none of that counted for anything, and he said the thing she had not expected, the thing that undid her more than any fire. "You're free," he said. "Truly free, now, for the first time. No aunt, no cage, no crown. You didn't choose. The bond is real. You've seen it. The whole world's seen it. And it still doesn't get to decide for you." He stepped back and gave her the room the way he always had. "So I'm not going to ask you to marry me, Oriane. You've had a lifetime of people deciding what you are. I'll not be one more. A breath, whatever you want, the throne, or the open road, or nothing at all to do with me ever again. It's yours. That's all. That's the whole of what I came to say." And he bowed to her, the king of all Marin, to the girl who'd been furniture, and turned to go. One might argue that the whole scandal had been the king's fault, for choosing a bride he couldn't even see, and the court of Marin did argue exactly that, for years, being a court that loved nothing so much as deciding whose fault a thing had been. But Oriane, who had by then had a great deal of time to think it over, had come to a different conclusion. The way she saw it, the fault was entirely her own, because she was the one who went after him. She caught him at the door of the throne hall. She had never in her life chased anything, but she crossed that whole vast floor of fallen ash and dropped veils at something close to a run, caught the king of Marin by his ruined collar for the third time in a month, and turned him around. "You forgot to let me answer," she said. "I didn't ask a question." "No," Oriane agreed. "You didn't. 11 years ago you were pulled out of a fire by a girl who never chose it, and a fortnight ago you chose a girl who never got a say, and just now you finally did the decent thing and gave me the choice, and then you walked off before I could make it, which, if I'm honest, is the single most cowardly thing I've watched you do." She was close enough now to feel the bond blazing between them, unhidden, both marks alight. "So I'll make it. Out loud, for no reason but that I want to." She lifted her bare, shining face to his. "You chose me, sight unseen, Corvin. Let me choose. You, having seen all of it, the mask and the fear and the fire you can't stand, and the whole tired man under the crown. I choose him. I choose you. Marry me." For once, it was the king of Marin who had nothing to say. The whole city came out for the wedding. In the end, the boy who'd been dragged from a fire by a girl he couldn't see, and the girl who'd walked out of 11 years of ash and chosen him back in the light, she wore no veil. She would never wear one again. The ash pot went into the same fire that had tried twice to take him, and she watched it burn without a flicker. He cried during the vows. She'd known he would. She didn't, quite, but it was a near thing, and the bond gave her away regardless, and he laughed at her through his own tears, and she found she no longer cared who saw her face do anything at all. "You chose me first, you know," he murmured when it was done. In the fire, before either of us knew. So really, none of this was ever my fault. No, Oriana agreed. Bare-faced and unhidden and entirely finally her own. Best decision I ever made.